This podcast discusses child sexual abuse and the impacts of harm on children and families. While we won't include graphic detail, some listeners may find this content distressing. Please take care while listening and consider pausing or seeking support if you need to. There's many and varied support services available, including Lifeline on 13 11 14, Kids Helpline for 5 to 25-year-olds on 1800 55 1800, and the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120. If you're outside of Australia, we encourage you to seek a local support service. Welcome back to In Plain Sight, a podcast examining how systems designed to protect children can fail and what must change to ensure they don't. I'm Kirstine, and in this series, we're walking carefully and deliberately through the findings of the In Plain Sight System Responses to Child Sexual Abuse Review. This podcast is not about retelling harm. It's about understanding systems, how they function, how they fracture, and how responsibility can become blurred when no single part is accountable for the whole. In the first episode, we began with the fundamental truth of childhood, that safety, care, and protection have the biggest impact on who a child will become. That episode grounded us in why this work matters. This episode, Part B, shifts the lens. Here, we focus on the system itself. We'll be looking at how concerns were identified, recorded, and responded to, how multiple agencies interacted or didn't, and how warning signs, visible over time, failed to trigger the protections children are entitled to expect. Joining me again is Luke Twyford, Principal Commissioner of the Queensland Family and Child Commission. He led the In Plain Sight review, and Luke brings deep experience in system oversight and reform, and throughout this review, his focus has remained clear, not on individual blame, but on understanding the conditions that allowed harm to occur. In this conversation, we will not revisit graphic details, nor will we speculate on individual intent. Instead, we will examine the structural blind spots, institutional dynamics, and the risk that was present, yet not adequately acted upon. What this review made clear is that harm does not occur in isolation. It occurs within systems, and when those systems fail to see, to connect, or to act. This is Part B of In Plain Sight, and this is where we begin to understand how harm can happen quietly, incrementally, in plain sight. Luke, thanks for joining me again. Let's jump straight into it. This review looked at the actions of a known offender as a case study. Talk to us about how that case study built the foundation for the review to really look at the systems and how Queensland responds to child sexual abuse.
Absolutely, thank you. Getting an understanding of this case, we obviously had the court records, the fact that there was a conviction already recorded, assisted us to look at, well, what did the police and the judicial process tell us about what had occurred. We then opened it up to victims and colleagues and organisations that have been involved in the story to really build a detailed timeline. That timeline is laid out in full in Part B of In Plain Sight. I'm not going to talk to the offending details, but we do that in the report. But I want to start probably at the front end for the police, which is really the back end of our timeline. There is a story here about remarkable police work. If you go through the highlights of what occurred, there was some photos uploaded in Italy to a darknet site. Police discovered those photos and identified Australian victims within that child sexual exploitation material. They then set about over 9 years, never putting those photos down and actually trying to track who were these children and what are the clues in the photos that could lead us to a place where we might assure ourselves that the abuse is not still happening and that we place accountability onto the people that are creating this material. They found in a photo a very small detail related to the bedding material. They then tracked over years of work who produced that bedding material, who sold it, who was it sold to. Of course, during that time, and why it takes 9 years, is not just the transactional casework, It's the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of additional child sexual abuse photos and materials being sent to them. The ability and resilience to not create a cold case and just put it aside because something new came in is remarkable. They actually track the bedding sheet down to a provider in Queensland. They track from that supplier early childcare centre in Queensland that's purchased it. They've got the former staffing list of that early childcare centre, and they found the man that created this. So you can imagine the euphoria of actually tracking this material down to catch a person. However, when they've gone and served the search warrant, they found hard disks and electronic files that showed that he's been abusing multiple children across multiple years, right throughout Queensland, New South Wales and Italy, predominantly in early childcare centres. So what is a story of police excellence turns into a story of how did we let this happen for so long? And when I say we, I don't just mean police. I mean all of us, the regulators, the organisations that employed him, the communities where he lived, worked and interacted. And so the timeline then really tries to go back. We see how many places he worked, how many times there were concerns raised about him. There were parents that spoke up about his concerning behaviour. There were colleagues that spoke up about his concerning behaviour. He was stood down or dismissed from at least 5 organisations, sometimes with no real records around why. He moved very frequently compared to the average worker in the early childcare setting, and there were police reports about him. Children were very clear, despite being non-verbal or only partially verbal, they were very clear in using their hands and their expressions to show signs of abuse, sexual abuse. But in all occasions, police investigations, regulatory investigations, organisational complaints processes, none of them led to an outcome where he was stopped. It was that earlier story of tracking bedding material over 9 years that led to his arrest. So I've just laboured that for you, sorry, to give you all that detail, but that's what we're dealing with here is people, particularly men, very attuned and strategic at gaining access to children, using abuse material they create to gain notoriety and status amongst groups of offenders and engaging with each other in dark net online spaces, which puts pressure on police and us, detecting these people online versus detecting them in the places where they are with children. That's 2 different streams of policing that we'll talk to later.
It's a very difficult story to hear, but absolutely I agree with you. It's remarkable work of the police to bring us, sadly, to where we are now. What I'm hearing is a real strong theme about blind spots, and that is absolutely something that is explored at length in the report. Talk us through what those blind spots are and why did it matter so much to focus on those?
Yeah. Well, if to answer the second part first, if we're going to make a difference, then we got to learn. So the blind spots were what we called missed opportunities. There were 18 explicit missed opportunities that we articulated across that timeline. A couple I would group as children disclosing to their parents, disclosing to people in the early childcare centres, and disclosing to police when they were interviewed, if they were interviewed. And what I would say for all of that is our criminal justice system does not know how to process the information from children. Children don't seem to be able to give evidence that the police have confidence in taking to a court, or that the court has confidence in prosecuting someone. And so I've just used language that blames the child there. I almost did that deliberately because I want people to react and understand that's the wrong approach. Our criminal justice system must do better at understanding how children disclose and how to use that as evidence against people who have harmed them. So that's probably the first category. The second category is colleagues and workers and people that run early childcare centres. In that category, we saw behaviours he was showing treated in isolation. So one day you would have an allegation, and I'll hypotheticalise it. People can read Part B for the details. But we might have an allegation that he used very negative words about a child's safety, or indeed he used a physical restraint on a child. In another occasion, a child was missing under his supervision. No one knew where the child was. Wasn't where she normally should be, nor was he. Those concerns are investigated as individual incidents. But when you build the timeline that we built, you can see that those concerns are happening at the same time. They're happening at the same time that police are also investigating someone with his name or a name sounding like his. But no one has the job to go, well, there's 3 incidents. Over the last 5 years, there's actually been 10. And we've got 2 police reports. All of this together is actually a big concern. And so my summary there is organisations are dealing with things as incidents rather than risks. And then finally, our criminal justice system overall, even notwithstanding what I said about children given evidence, they respond to crime. So you almost need to prove a crime's occurred before you can investigate a crime. And I've got a lot of positive feelings towards the role of policing. But we were challenged at the start of this review to say, well, is it a failure of police in not protecting these children? Because there's a line between investigating a crime and protecting. And right now, what we have said and what we have shown is it's no one's real job to protect children from child sexual abuse. The police will do it if we can confirm a crime's occurred. An organisation will do it within the boundaries of what they're paid and funded to do. And parents are left ringing Child Safety, ringing Premier's Office, ringing Queensland Family and Child Commission, trying to find out who can actually protect my children, because I've got to worry, but the police have told me it's not reaching the criminal threshold. So where do I go?
That's really interesting about thresholds, because that really speaks to this idea of blind spots. So if it doesn't reach a threshold for action, then there's actually no pathway for parents, for families to pursue to reach some kind of a resolution.
And if I can, there's people in our community today carrying a lot of guilt because they knew something. And I don't actually think they should be carrying the guilt. They saw something, or their child told them something, and they spoke up. They told the organisation, they told the police. Their complaints were rejected. They were told, there's not sufficient information to take this forward. But they knew in their heart or their stomach that something wasn't right. And I can only imagine, and I've spoken to some of these parents, I can only imagine what it felt like many years later when those concerns that they had were validated. And so those blind spots are critical. The ability of a system to actually listen when a child or a parent says, I don't feel okay about this, that's what we need to address.
What's your message to those parents who may have raised concerns and weren't able to resolve their issues?
Thank you. Thank you for being the brave one that spoke up, because I can guarantee from my work that for every person that speaks up, there's probably another 2 or 3 that didn't know how to, were too scared to, felt awkward. And so the bravery in speaking up should be commended, celebrated and thanked, because that's how we're going to change the protection of children into the future. More parents speaking up.
And that's really speaking to a point that you made in our previous episode about changing the culture and bringing these conversations to the fore and feeling comfortable raising issues about child sexual abuse.
Absolutely.
Let's move now to institutional dynamics. What did you observe about how the agencies and the systems interacted?
Poorly is the one-word answer. So within an organisation, here we're talking about early childcare, and it's had a lot of attention in the last 24 months. But let's just call it an organisation. Some of them are small. The person that owns the organisation, owns the company, is actually working there, whereas others are big. You are working, you have an offender and the child in a place, that is overseen by a state manager, that is overseen by a national manager, that is overseen by a CEO, that is overseen by a board, none of whom are in Queensland. And so you're dealing with different sized organisations at the system level. Some are very good at resolving concerns and complaints from parents. Others are really procedural. You have to log onto a website and upload a complaint, and you don't know who you're talking to, and you get a receipt number. Through to the very personal in both good and bad ways. Parents walking around the centre trying to find someone with authority to make a complaint to, and the workers saying, that's not my job, you need to go see insert other name. So that's within an organisation, but then you see that organisation, even when it does accept a complaint, even when it does say, we need to look into this, we'll have a discussion with the offender. Sometimes they're not telling their regulatory authority. Sometimes they are telling their regulatory authority and then therefore thinking they don't need to do anything else. The regulatory authority is sometimes telling police, and sometimes they're saying, well, now that we've told police, we don't need to do anything. So pretty soon you get a chain of organisations all aware of a risk, but all looking at each other saying, well, are you going to take the lead in this? In our timeline, we had a regulator close the case because police said there was no concern. When we spoke to police, well, that's not what they said. They said there's no criminal evidence. And so that's a very different thing. And so understanding how the whole system works doesn't appear to be a very good understanding. And I understand that. If you're running an early childcare centre, you don't really understand blue card, regulatory body, police, who does what, why they do it, what process they use. But our recommendations are saying that we need to bring all that together. We need the system to not just be 4 different agencies all doing their own thing. We need collaboration, we need connection, and it's not just information sharing. That's not going to be enough. We need to centralise who looks at the risk for children, particularly for child sexual abuse.
Do you see that centralisation as being a potential solution to what sounds like a very complex system or systems potentially not working together?
Yes, and I think more fundamentally, to put accountability back onto the offender, we need to be smarter in understanding that these people move to wherever they have the easiest access to children. When we strengthen one sector, if we introduce more regulation and protection in early childcare, we can't get complacent that we've fixed the problem. The people that want to harm children will move to another sector. They'll find jobs in other organisations where there are children. The report we've produced and the recommendations we've made are deliberately saying not only do we need to centralise how we identify risk, we need to make it a whole of society, whole of government issue. In order to protect our children, we need equal levels of protection wherever our children are. Everyone has to be vigilant, and that means we need greater leadership, greater connection, greater coordination.
Thank you for bringing it back to the offender, because that's the subject of my next question, which is looking at the timeline of their offending. So I understand that this was part of the terms of reference. That sounds like an enormous task, pulling together close to 20 years worth of information. Talk us through how you developed that timeline.
Well, we had great information from the court process and the police files, so they formed the basis of that. But then writing to each of the organisations that we knew had been involved, asking them about his employment history, asking them about their policies and procedures, any complaints that were recorded in the time that he worked there or shortly after. So we had some great cooperation from the places where he worked. We certainly got a lot of intelligence and information from the employers who had been part of the court process. But also interestingly, and I think this is a core part of Part B that people might not get on first read, the organisations where he didn't offend. So when we identified from the criminal record all the places he offended, we noticed the gaps. And then we started to ask ourselves, well, where was he during those periods? And so going to those organisations gave us a lot of different insight into how to protect children. We have what we put in the report, this confirmation bias. If we build all of our intelligence about pedophiles and people that abuse children from the people we catch, we're not understanding the people we don't catch. And that's a really dangerous way to make policy, because we'll continue to catch the people who we would have catched. We won't necessarily ever get to the people that are still at large, still a risk, and still offending.
We can learn a lot from those best practice examples that are happening in the community and those organisations, big and small, who are working really well together to protect children.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Without getting into the detail of the recommendations, I think there's another episode where we will do that. Tell us about what prevention really requires from systems. We were just sort of starting to talk about some of that there, but from a systems level, what does prevention look like?
I think my one-word answer is vigilance. There is no policy, no CCTV system, no recruitment policy that will ever ensure our children are always safe. What we need to do is have vigilance. We need more than one person around our children, particularly when the parents are not present. We need to make our community, particularly those that work with children, more aware of what threat looks like and what grooming looks like and what a child disclosure looks like. In our minds, I think we've oversimplified all three of those things, and we've actually got some myths that need to be busted. Coming back to the title In Plain Sight, that is one of them. Don't worry about the monster lurking in the shadow. Worry about the person that looks super trustworthy. That's who you should be worried about. The person in a position of authority, acting alone with implied authority to care for our children. That's where these people want to be. That's how they present themselves. So as soon as you start to see the world differently, you start to see where our protections are weak, and you start to see what we can do to increase the prevention of child sexual abuse.
Queensland has a new Child Safe Organisation Act, which is starting to come into effect across the state. Its aim is to create cultures that prioritise the safety of children when they do interact with business and organisations. How do you see that culture of prevention influencing or interacting with this need for response?
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental. As I said, if the solution, if the prevention recipe is vigilance, then you create a culture of vigilance. And so it's really speaking to how do you as an institution, an organisation, a group of adults create a operating culture, an operating model where there is constant vigilance around the risk to children, the threat to children and the safety of children. And the Child Safe Organisations Act, the Child Safe Standards, which are now national, really speak to how you do that. In order to create a culture, you need strong leadership. You need clear policies. You need to have the right recruitment. You need, which is really actually code for you need the right people in your organisation. You need the right complaints processes. You need to listen to the voices of children, and you need to monitor your performance and regularly review, because this is a constant journey. It's not a set and forget. So Child Safe Standards, as I've just broadly outlined and garbled, come together to help create that culture. It's a culture where the safety of children takes precedence and prominence against all other concerns. In parts of our report, we really hold up the work health safety model and the journey that Australia went on for worker safety. As a CEO now, I will enter most corporate meetings and there'll be an agenda called risk, and one of the top risks will be the safety of my workers. How do we create the safety of children as a risk item in all the risk meetings that CEOs have, particularly for organisations that have daily care and control or a fundamental duty to protect children? That's at the heart of the Child Safe Organisations Act.
And really speaks to the operation of a system.
Absolutely.
Beyond policies and processes, what did the review reveal about culture and the constraints professionals were working under?
Yeah, great question. And I think it echoes back to episode 1. Colleagues of this offender weren't always sure how to raise their concern. They would speak about it to their other colleagues, but not necessarily formalise a complaint to management. There's still this feeling that I can see and observe that we don't want to be the person to accuse another person of something so awful. And the confidence to do that, I think, is sometimes lacking. I can see that, I can feel that in my own world and work. And so what I've done some deep thinking on is, how do we make it in an organisation that you're not accusing someone of abusing a child, you are articulating in a formal way a possible risk. Because if we could all get more comfortable saying, what are the risks and what are we doing about them? I think that's a coming together that might help us have this dialogue easier. But I don't want to weaken that too much, because ultimately this is about courage to call out what we see. It's the courage to know what grooming looks like, to see it and to point at it and say that is a grooming behaviour. And the fortitude of people to stand back and say, I hear what you're saying, my reason for behaving that way was X, Y, and Z, and then a testing of the appropriateness and the motivation. Because there are parts of our system where people will be falsely accused, but it's almost as if we're so afraid of falsely accusing someone that we never accuse someone that should be accused.
And the alternative is unacceptable.
Absolutely.
I think that's what we need to encourage people to think about, that by not raising an issue, we're potentially leaving a child open to risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That speak up and speak out mantra, see it, report it. That's got to drive the future of child safeguarding.
Absolutely. We haven't yet spoken about a chapter in Part A, as it didn't sit well in the episode titled Childhood Matters, so I would like to cover it now. The report challenges some deeply held assumptions about people who sexually abuse children. What does the evidence tell us about those individuals, and why is it so important that we recognise those myths and that we really move beyond them?
It's a part of the report that I was deeply troubled by, and it does shatter some myths. We included 7 case studies from across the world that also placed the offender we were particularly focused on in context. Some of the myths are that they are lonely men, males, who are quirky and weird and don't fit into society, that they're the outsider, that they are a monster, and that they, have this incessant need to prey on children, and you can visibly see them preying and being predators. The truth is much more confronting. They are obviously predominantly male, but we shouldn't lose sight that some are female, and if we just take a gendered approach, we're going to be blind to some of the risks. So predominantly male, predominantly in professional roles, high-paid roles, mostly married with family, often, if not nearly always, in positions where there is close connection to children. And if it's not the profession, then it's their volunteer role or their out of work role. And nearly always spoken about as someone that deeply cares for children. It is all the red flags of someone that has strategically embedded themselves into exactly the role they should not have. And that makes it really hard as a male working in a child-focused industry. That's confronting to read, but also not surprising when you start to understand that these offenders have motivations and their motivations play out. It makes them harder to spot, and it's deliberate. But I'd also come back to a part of that chapter, Kirstine, that was even slightly more confronting, which was media monitoring of how often does this happen. The case we reviewed occurred at the time. There was 2 other cases, one in Victoria, one in New South Wales, and each time the headlines were worst ever. Once in a lifetime, horrendous case. We wanted to test that, and actually every 2.3 days in Queensland alone, there was another person in court or in the newspaper for child sexual exploitation material, creating it, possessing it, or trading in it. Australia Australians are some of the highest users of child sexual exploitation material. Places like Mexico, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia actually see Australian males as the biggest risk to the sexual exploitation of their children. This is an Australian problem. There are so many Australians engaging in this form of abuse that articulating who they are and what we need to look for becomes quite scary.
There's a real imbalance in the prevalence and the public awareness
Absolutely.
of the issue. My final question, and thank you, this has been quite a long episode and we've dealt with quite a lot of confronting topics. This final one is about access. So the environments and the relationships that allow abuse to occur. You were just alluding to that in the last question. What does the review tell us about how access and opportunity rather than individual types, so some of the myths that you were just explaining there, how do they create the risk for children?
Yeah, excellent question. There's a lot of theory on this. We were blessed in our review to have an expert panel with people that have studied this. We also commissioned 4 academic institutions to produce best practice research for us. They're all available on our website. And I'm not going to purport to cover that in depth. And I acknowledge I'm not the expert in this. But what I would say my key takeaway from this part of the review was actually that the people that want to harm children, that want to abuse children, groom the adults around them first. We've spent a lot of time talking about how adults groom children. Actually, the mic drop moment for me in this part of the review was how they groom other adults. They earn the trust of the parents, they earn the trust of their colleagues, they earn the trust of their boss before they start to groom the children. And it's not a long process. It could be in a minute, it could be in the course of half a day, which is another really confronting thing. Coming into this review, I thought grooming was a months-long process. But that's step one, is in order for them to gain access to children, they present themselves as trustworthy. They then groom the adults around them. They test boundaries with the adults and the institution before they test the boundaries with the children. And they seek to isolate. And that's another interesting set of words for me. I thought that meant that they would take a child off in the distance, behind closed doors. But really, the act of isolation is one that's more conceptual. It's more about validating to anyone that might be supervising that there's no need to watch them because they're trustworthy, they know what they're doing, they're an expert. And so the act of isolation is actually in the mind. It's about how do I make sure no one pays close attention to me and what I do to children in a very manipulative, deceitful, and confronting way when you look at it in retrospect. And that's what has kept me up at night writing this report, is how much I can see from this case study in retrospect. And how do I help myself and others see it in the moment? And that's the key challenge for us moving forward.
Luke, thank you very much for your insights. Very grateful that you've shared them with us today.
Thanks, Kirsty.
What this conversation makes clear is that harm does not occur in isolation. Understanding these blind spots is not about blame, it's about learning. Thanks for joining me for episode 2 of In Plain Sight. In the next episode, we turn to what must change. I hope you join me again then for When Warnings Were Ignored.